If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon, link is in the description.
Chapter 508, Revelation. After that, Nick left the office feeling much better about the situation than he did going into it. Sure, he knew that it was still going to be a stressful next few weeks as the news got out and everyone showed their reactions. But with such huge influences backing him, Nick knew he would weather the storm just fine. Even more, Nick didn't feel like he really needed to worry about the Order of the Golden Sands anymore after reaching Tier 4. It needed to be understood that he held the full knowledge of Salazar Slytherin's library as well as all the information and skills Nick had personally researched at his fingertips. It would not be a stretch of the imagination to say he could likely fight Voldemort or Dumbledore to a standstill, or at least close to one, without any tricks or exploits. With those, however, he figured that he might even be able to defeat them or at least force them to flee. There was one major problem, however, that he had to deal with in the form of the upper limit of power that the world could support. Even now Nick could feel the discomfort that his body had in the low mana environment of the world. At the moment it was just a very mild discomfort, not unlike a headache, but spread throughout his full body. While his new mana system and tier had caused his mana growth rate to drop in speed to the average level a third year would experience, it was still dangerously fast for a Tier 4. In fact, Nick figured he had at most a year and a half before he reached the peak of Tier 4, and his tier exceeded it naturally without him increasing his power actively at all. This was to say that if Grindelwald doesn't complete his ritual within that time, Nick very well might have to hole up on the island just to survive. The mere idea was uncomfortable for Nick to even consider, so one could easily imagine how bad it would be to actually experience. Thankfully, I still have things I need to do before this becomes a real problem, Nick thought as he walked through the hallways, ignoring the stares he was getting. Soon enough he reached the workshop and entered it, but left the door open. This was intentional, as Nick knew that as word spread around the castle like wildfire, more and more people will seek him out to see if it was true. None of the students will likely be able to figure out why Nick gives them such a funny feeling, but the professors would probably be the opposite. Each and every professor in the school was either an expert in their own right or had the high qualifications needed to teach here, even in the case of the Dada position. One had to remember that if you looked at each of the professors for the position in the canon timeline, they each had their own set of circumstances that made them appear capable of teaching, even the idiot Lockhart. This meant that even when desperately looking for people to take the position, Dumbledore still required a certain level of perceived competence. In Lockhart's case, he appeared to have ample experience in dealing with the dark arts and creatures considered dark, even if it turned out to be false in the end. In Lupin's case, however, the man was not only a werewolf but had fought against the Death Eaters and Voldemorts over a decade ago and had been keeping an eye on other werewolf packs for Dumbledore until he was hired for the Dada position. To Nick's surprise, however, the first professor to come to him wasn't any of the usual suspects like Flitwick and McGonagall, but rather Snape. "So you have finally taken that step as well, it seems," the man said with what looked to be approval on his face. "You changed your race as well?" Nick asked, stunned to not have noticed it at all. "Indeed, however, unlike yours, my own transformation could barely be considered a very large one, as I merely changed myself to be closer to the art of podiwunnering, a variant form of humanity if you'd like," Snape said calmly. Nick thought about it and could admit that it would likely be such a minor change that it would barely even register in his magical senses. Dumbledore did mention that it was considered a fairly expected thing for wizards of a certain level to change their race, but I hadn't even considered any of the professors to have done so," Nick admitted honestly. Chapter 509, Coming Clean. Snape nodded. "He is correct, but you are slightly mistaken in thinking majority of your professors have changed their race. In fact, the exact opposite is true, as only myself and Professor Sprout have done so, while the rest are the same as they were born," the man explained seriously. Nick would be lying if he said that he wasn't surprised by this information. While he can understand a few of the human professors such as Trelawney and Burbage refusing to change their race, the others would likely benefit heavily from it. As for the professors that were already inhuman like Flitwick and Hagrid, there was simply no reason why they would need to modify their race. Hagrid also simply couldn't do it to begin with, since besides what he had self-taught himself, his spell work and knowledge on the magical arts was barely at the 4th or 5th year level. Nick couldn't see Hagrid changing his race anyways, since he was perfect at handling magical beasts to begin with. "I am surprised you haven't asked what the differences between my new race and being human were," Nick said honestly. Snape scoffed. "Sharing my own changes means nothing, as knowing them does not allow it to be used against me. Your new race is clearly a different matter," the man said sternly. "I see, then you must be curious if potions still work on me the same then?" Nick questioned, and Snape nodded. "They do indeed work the same, as there was no change in that regard," Nick said, and the Podiwunner nodded before leaving. It came as little surprise to Nick that after Snape it was Flitwick who came to see him. My goodness, that presence is truly something else to experience in person, No wonder the rumors were so hard to understand. The half-goblin said with a smile. To be honest, I hadn't wanted to reveal myself quite so early, but things rarely tend to work out the way we hope. Nick said with a smirk. Very true, still I am concerned that you chose to make such a decision before maturing magically. I do hope this won't adversely affect you in any way. Flitwick said honestly. Nick smiled and shook his head. Quite the opposite, in fact. I already hold more magical power than anyone else in this school besides Dumbledore, and not to slight the man, but I can even use it better too due to the differences in magical anatomy I have. He explained seriously. To prove this point, Nick waved his hand and cast a series of spells wandlessly. Flitwick watched in amazement at this and seemed to quickly figure out the crux of it. You can freely cast spells without a wand without sacrificing power? He asked, and Nick nodded. Incredible. I dare say you may be right in claiming to be better than Albus at using magic, as even he cannot wandlessly cast magic so well. Flitwick said with a wide smile. Nick chatted with Flitwick a bit more after that, and even had McGonagall show up at some point and scold Nick for his reckless choice while also congratulating him as well in her stern but caring manner. Then came the much more problematic part of his racial reveal in the form of his friends. Flitwick knew that what came next was none of his business and left with the excuse that he had homework to grade. Nick couldn't blame him either, as what came next was bound to be uncomfortable. So what's up with that weird feeling you are giving off? Tracy asked bluntly once all of his friends had gathered in the workshop. Nick waved his hand, causing the door to shut without him moving from his seat. How much do each of you understand about the path to power that wizards follow? Nick asked seriously. Isn't it just learning spells and potions and stuff? Ron asked, confused. Nick chuckled. While that is indeed a good part of it, I am afraid that it is not quite so simple. See, there is in fact a grading system for how powerful a being is, and by extension what they were capable of. Tier 1 beings are the weakest mature magical beings. Freshly graduated average graded Hogwarts students fall into this category. Tier 2 is where most wizards tend to stop at, and as such is also fairly mediocre. Tier 3 is where the truly skilled and talented tend to sit. A good example would be McGonagall, Snape and Flitwick are at this point. Tier 4, however, is the dividing line between those talented but not fully focused like the professors and the most brilliant of wizards sit. Dumbledore and myself are both at this point, which is why we need to restrain our magic, or else our very presences would create a feeling of suppression to those weaker than us. As for beyond this tier of power, I am not entirely sure. Nick explained seriously. Chapter 510, Coming Clean, 2. Is that why you have your magic hidden away at the moment? Luna asked curiously, and Nick nodded. He then for the briefest instant released his mana and watched as each of them flinched. Don't misunderstand me, I am not Dumbledore's equal in terms of pure power, just on the same playing field he is. Nick said seriously. Where do we stand then? Daphne asked with a disbelieving look that told Nick she probably had an idea of the answer. With the exception of Harry, none of you are even tier 1, and even in his case it's due to extraordinary circumstances rather than him being that much better than the rest of you. Nick said honestly. His friends recoiled like they were injured at the statement, and he could understand why too, as he had basically just told them that they were basically ants compared to him. It was a vast gap that was made even harder to accept by his age being about the same as theirs, a point that got brought up by Hermione. You are the same age as us though, so how are you so different? She asked with a frown. I was always different than all of you, more talented, and more willing to go to questionable lengths for power and knowledge. Did you know I have undergone no less than 10 rituals to improve my power? Would any of you have even been willing to spend millions of galleons for a relatively small boost in power, or even go hunt a creature that might kill you for the same? My drive and willingness to utilize every opportunity that I could for growth is what makes me different. Nick spoke firmly and without any hesitation to make it clear that he wasn't even operating on the same mental level as all of them. It was harsh but necessary, as if he didn't make it clear now then there was a good possibility of them coming to resent him out of envy or just distancing themselves from him entirely. This was obviously not something he wanted, so he chose to come clean. As expected, each of them looked horrified at the information. How could you use such dark magic? Ron asked, seemingly offended by the very idea. Rituals aren't dark magic despite what the ministry tries to say, but I will not deny that they are dangerous in the wrong hands. The basic idea behind rituals is that you give something in exchange for receiving something else. Alchemy works almost exactly the same but on a slightly different scale than rituals. The reason they are banned, however, isn't because of the ones that use actual dark magic, but rather because of how dangerous they are if done incorrectly. A single mistake and the results can turn very ugly in an instant. The most common example of this is actually the animagus ritual, yes, the same one Gonagall, Sirius, and even Harry's father willingly underwent. A single mistake in that ritual can have devastating and sometimes permanent effects on the wizard themselves. All rituals share that same risk, but in exchange, if they are done correctly, they can give great improvements to oneself. If it helps, none of the rituals I underwent were of the dark variety, just expensive. Nick explained seriously. How can we believe you? What's to say you aren't lying about this as well? Ron accused, which stung a bit for Nick, but he understood where the boy was coming from. I have a list of the rituals I underwent, to which you are free to ask Dumbledore himself about if my own word isn't good enough. He himself had likely used a few when he was younger and can confirm what I have said. Nick answered honestly. Are you even still human after all those rituals? Daphne asked, since as an old pureblood house Greengrass was no stranger to rituals, and so she knew he was probably telling the truth about the ones he used. Which brings us to the next thing that needs to be addressed: wizards aren't fully human to begin with. What do you mean? Harry asked, confused. Even after all of these revelations, it was still clear to Harry that Nick was still the same as he always was, and he might be many things, but a dark wizard isn't one of them. Wizards are fundamentally different creatures than humans. How else could you explain why when two wizards have a child, it also almost always has a bit of magical ability as well? Even in the case of those born of two muggles, this fact holds true. Wizards are very similar to humans but are not in fact human. This fact becomes even more true the more powerful a wizard becomes as they get farther and farther from baseline muggles. Nick said seriously. Chapter 511, Coming Clean, 3. So the pure blood theory is correct? Hermione asked with a frown. Nick scoffed. It's based on the truth, but over time it has been perverted into the incorrect assumption that having pure blood automatically made one better than those without. Fact is that talent doesn't work like that at all, and if anything, them inbreeding like they have has only ruined the advantages that their bloodline gave them originally. He explained disdainfully. I knew they were wrong. Ron said triumphantly, but a glare from Nick killed his buzz immediately. If all this is true, then why is it not public knowledge? Daphne asked, confused, since logically something like this should be well known. That would be the Ministry's doing actually, as over time it has slowly suppressed this information so that only the really powerful knew the truth. For good reason too, as if you think the attitudes of the pure-blood supremacists are bad, now imagine how they would act knowing that they are in fact superior to muggles on an evolutionary scale. Nick said sternly, and his friends all paled at the mental image they got. It'd be a bloodbath. Ron said in horror. Yep, so do keep this information to yourselves. Anyways, back to the original question on my humanity, the answer is a very large nope. As I am right now, I am even higher up on the evolutionary ladder than even wizards after changing my race to a better one. According to Dumbledore, it is actually something many powerful witches and wizards do as well. Another very well kept secret, that bit of information. Nick said casually. What? There was a group exclamation at that information, which Nick found amusing even if expected. It was why he said it like that after all. Nick feigned confusion. Is something I said unclear? I'll explain it if you point out which part it is. He said reassuringly. All of it. What do you mean you are even higher up? How common is it to change race? Why is all this information kept secret? So many questions. Tracy shot off, and the others were clearly right there with her. Nick nodded along with a smirk. All good questions, that the answers to which are, in order: I am superior to baseline wizards, hell if I know, and because it would cause problems if it was well known. He said, still smirking. What do you mean you don't know? Daphne asked in frustration. All right, enough teasing from me then. The only reason I know about the whole common to change one's race thing is because Dumbledore told me. Fun fact, by the way, Snape and Sprout have also changed their races. Nick said honestly. Bet he's a slug person. Ron said with a snicker. Nick shrugged. It's possible, but I have no clue besides that it helps him in making potions somehow. He said casually. My head hurts. Luna complained, and everyone else nodded in agreement. After that, Nick got asked all sorts of questions about the things he told them about, and he answered most of them honestly, though he left out a few details on purpose. For example, he didn't mention his agelessness and avoided the topic of how one would even go about changing one's race, though Hermione ruined that one with deductive reasoning. It wasn't hard to figure out that one could use rituals to change one's race, a fact she shared with everyone else, thus forcing Nick to give very stern warnings about the risks involved. Lupin got the short end of the stick in that particular warning, as Nick used the failed ritual that made werewolves as an example. Still, all things considered, Nick felt good about how that whole conversation went, as once his friends got past the skepticism, things mostly returned to normal. The word mostly was key in this case, as some change was to be expected after such a massive revelation. Nick had also used the excuse that his current state was from a failed experiment, which, like Dumbledore said, was enough to satisfy most of the world's curiosity but was totally ineffective on those powerful enough to know better. Nick found it even stranger that a few days after that point he received a letter asking for a ceasefire of hostility between him and the Order of the Golden Sands. The part that made him frown, however, was that the letter mentioned him as a Tier 4, which was something only himself, Dumbledore and those Nick himself told should be aware of. In the end, Nick chose to assume the Order used some sort of divination magic and took steps to prevent that in the future before ignoring the Order entirely. Chapter 512, Mastering Knowledge. Since he could not safely seek to increase his power, Nick chose to take another route and focus on his skill and knowledge for the rest of the school year. He still avoided the Dwemer lexicon though, as he wanted to fully master the knowledge he gained from Slytherin's library first. He understood it, of course, but that didn't mean he had mastered it, so he focused on that for the last remaining month of the school year he had before he needed to start the binding process for the realm if he wanted to finish before the start of the next year. The downside to having such a vast repertoire of knowledge to master reared its ugly head during this time, as Nick had nearly 1,000 spells, potion recipes and other assorted magics each to work on. The spells were the easiest, as he merely needed to cast it a single time to see the magic's true form and function thanks to his magical senses. This meant while it was a tedious effort to cast all the spells, he mastered them afterwards immediately after only a single success with them. The spells in Parseltongue were especially difficult but also the most rewarding to learn for Nick. The language had a magical resonance with nature that empowered that variety of spells greatly. Even more interesting for Nick was that the snake summoning spell Serpensortia that normally only summoned non-magical snake species could also summon magical ones if used with Parseltongue. Of course, like all beast summoning magics, there was not any part of the spell that gives control over the summoned creature after it arrived. With Parseltongue, however, this was an entirely different matter, as all snakes, magical or otherwise, felt reverence to the language and were usually more than happy to obey so long as the speaker didn't order something innately self-destructive. This was how Nick had managed to bring a rune spore into Harry's employ in a funny way. Rune spores were usually about 7 feet long snakes with orange and black striped scales that possessed a unique 3-headed body that was controlled by 3 joined minds for each head. The left head was the planner, the middle head was the visionary that imagined the magical snake's future actions, and the right head was the critic that vetoed any plans or actions that it found incorrect. The funny part was that the right head was constantly in danger of getting destroyed by the other 2 heads if it got too naggy, so the species rarely lived their naturally bountiful lifespans. In a way, the snake reminded Nick of what Harry, Hermione, and Ron would have been like had he not been around. Harry himself shared a similar thought process and had thus been able to teach the serpent how to work with each of its personalities. The snake was scarily effective once this happened, as it efficiently imagined, planned, and executed its actions perfectly. After mastering the spells, Nick split his focus between the potions and Medi-Magic with the help of Snape and Madame Pomfrey, both of which were more than eager to assist him with his mastery, as it benefited them as well in their chosen fields. Much of Slytherin's knowledge in these fields could be considered new and exciting, so both experts were happy with the situation, even if it resulted in them arguing with Nick a lot as they clashed with his knowledge of the professions. Snape, for example, often debated Nick over the choice of ingredients, the boil time of the potions, and even how wasteful the recipes were. The man was a harsh critic but clearly held great appreciation for the knowledge Nick had as well. As a result, Nick mastered the pody-wondering knowledge of the library at a staggering pace alongside the Medi-Magic knowledge as well, with Madame Pomfrey using her modern understanding of the field to rebuff his own ancient one or perfect certain parts of it further. Nick was sure that both experts knew very well that they were being used by him to master his knowledge, but he also was pretty sure they were fine with that. Soon the final week of the school year came around and Nick was mostly satisfied with the progress he made mastering the knowledge from the library. "I'd say I've gotten it about 70% mastered if I ignore the dark magic part of it," he thought as he played a game of wizarding chess against Ron. "Blast it all!" The redhead cursed after noticing the trap he had fallen into, which forced him to sacrifice his queen to save his king. "And that is checkmate," Nick said after moving his other knight to seal off the king's escape routes with the second trap that had gone unnoticed due to the first. Chapter 513, Grim Fate. Best 3 out of 4. Ron asked, frustrated at his string of losses. Nick shook his head. "Maybe later, for now though you might want to check to make sure you've got everything for summer break. If you need anything during that time I won't be able to help you at all," he said calmly. "You never did say why you were going to be busy over summer break," Harry pointed out curiously from nearby. "Nothing you all need to worry about," Nick said casually. "You might as well have not said anything at all," Ron complained. Nick shrugged. If you must know, I am preparing a trump card for the future, so I don't really want to go into details about it. He said honestly. You are almost as powerful as Dumbledore, what in Merlin's name could you need a trump card for? Hermione asked, confused. If I'm lucky I won't need it, but if I am not, then I'd rather have it than not. Nick answered seriously. This was also very true, as while it was likely Zeus would end up destroying his body at least once, it was also possible that he would never have his body destroyed as well. Anyways, you really need to convince your family to move out of London before the end of next year. Nick told Hermione seriously. Why? She asked, confused. This thing Grindelwald's doing is going to turn things really ugly in places with a lot of people like that, and they might get caught up in the chaos of it all if they stay. If you can, I highly advise having them get as far from the city as possible before it starts. Nick warned sternly. You know what the Dark Lord is trying to do? Ron exclaimed in shock. There's no point in hiding it anymore, since from my calculations he should set off the event sometime towards the end of next year. Basically he means to flood the earth with magical energy at a density that hasn't been seen here in a very long time. When he does this, the Muggles are going to be set back centuries on a technological standpoint, and even worse is that most of the species of animals and magical beasts on the planet are going to evolve into stronger, smarter, and more difficult to control versions in huge numbers. Once this happens, the wizarding word will be forced into revealing itself and things will get bloody before they calm down. So if you can, Hermione, it would be for the best if you had your family move near Ron's, or at the least take refuge with Sirius. Nick said seriously, and his friends looked horrified. What a rotten thing to do! Ron said spitefully, and no one disagreed. The Ministry and Dumbledore must have a plan to stop this from happening, right? Tracy asked hopefully, but Nick shook his head. They have long accepted that they can't stop it and have been preparing for it in hopes of reducing the amount of casualties to come. Nick said honestly. The events of this coming up year will likely be some of the brightest points in wizarding history that will be remembered after this new world order sets in. He added. How could someone knowingly do something like this? Luna asked, genuinely confused. Nick knew why too, as she was innately kind and helpful and simply couldn't imagine the sort of thoughts that would lead one down such a path. Grindelwald believes this to be the best way for wizarding kind to have a bright future. Sadly, his belief is not entirely wrong either. Few probably realize it, but with the way the Muggles' technology is rapidly improving, we only have about 7 or 8 years before they discover our existence, and that will end one of a few ways, with few of them being positive. In fact, there is a good chance that the Muggles will go to war with us with the intention of wiping us out entirely. Nick explained honestly. How can you say that? Hermione asked, offended by the implication behind what he said. Muggles have committed genocide and enslaved others for things as little as a different religion, skin color, and simply because they wanted what the others had all throughout history. The only difference between then and now is that they have gotten more efficient in killing each other. So what do you think they would do when they discover that magic is very much real and that wizards have something they can't have themselves? I can tell you now, it's not going to be smile and embrace us with open arms. It may well become another dark age for wizard kind, and I honestly can't see us survive it in any meaningful capacity. Nick said sternly. Chapter 514, Cascade Effect. The mood was grim for the group after that, and Nick chose to let his friends have the time needed to process this information. It was a tough piece of meat to swallow, but he was confident that they would be able to handle it without much issue. What he failed to consider, however, was that Hermione's bleeding heart would cause her to do something really short-sighted. She sent a letter to her parents containing this information, and her parents, without the correct context for the situation, did what any upstanding person would and started warning their friends, who in turn warned their own friends. This created a ripple across all of London that drew the attention of the Ministry and Muggle governments both. A simple letter had caused a breach of the statute of secrecy that revealed the existence of wizards to the Muggle government in the British Isles beyond the Prime Minister and royal family that was already in the know about it. The Ministry quickly traced the source of the problem back to Hermione, and early in the morning of the final day of school 3 Aurors came for her. Hermione Granger, in accordance with the laws pertaining to the statute of secrecy, you are hereby under arrest for revealing the existence of magic to Muggles. Please come quietly. The Auror in charge of the case said loudly before motioning for the other 2 Aurors to take the horrified girl. Nick wasted no time at all diving into the leading Auror's head to figure out what was going on before feeling a great deal of frustration when he found out. Dumbledore rapidly approached the group as he hadn't gotten any warning about this and wanted it explained. The leading Auror explained the charges against Hermione and how they came about, and the girl herself was in tears. As far as she knew, all she had done was tell her parents what was going on in order to convince them to leave the city like Nick suggested, but she had clearly not realized what actions her parents would take. What a mess! Nick complained in frustration. I'm just saying that this doesn't sound like Hermione at all, she's smarter than this. Ron argued for the umpteenth time. I told all of you what was going on so you weren't caught off guard, but somehow she took that to mean telling her parents as well, and so here we are. Nick said with a sigh. That's so stupid though. How was she supposed to understand that warning her parents would lead to this? Tracy asked angrily. The ministry doesn't care about the intent behind the action so much as the outcome. In this case, Hermione has caused a serious problem. A lot of people needed to be obliviated to fix it, so this does not look good for her at all. She won't be going to Azkaban though if Dumbledore and I have anything to say about it. Nick said firmly. What can you even do? Politics won't help much at this point, and aren't you rather low on money at the moment? Daphne asked, confused. You'll know soon enough. Nick said before leaving to go find Dumbledore. The old man was of course in his office getting ready to leave himself when Nick walked in. The old goat looked at Nick and sighed. You know there is no going back if you do this, right? He asked softly. Nick nodded. We both knew it would come to this eventually, but I agree that the timing is less than ideal. He said, determined. The signs of Nick becoming the next great wizard had long since been clear, and both of them knew that at some point Nick was going to show that he was the next powerhouse of the British Isles. In a way, it was Dumbledore's time to step out of the spotlight and let someone from the younger generation take it. Hermione's matter was troublesome for Dumbledore to solve because he was a well-known factor to be considered, but Nick was an entirely new powerhouse that would make Fudge more likely to pardon Hermione than test how he would react to her being sentenced. The way to accomplish this was quite simple really. Nick was going to go to the ministry with Dumbledore, all while letting his mana flow from him freely. There was no chance in hell that Fudge wouldn't immediately be able to understand the implication behind the suppression that felt like Dumbledore's own. If that is your choice, then I can only wish you luck on your path, as it is a treacherous one. The old goat said before having Fawkes teleport them both to the ministry. Chapter 515, Aggressive Negotiation. POV Fudge. It had been headache after headache once Grindelwald's plan was revealed, as we all scrambled to stop him, and when that failed to preserve life. To top it all off, there was the Azkaban incident that resulted in that monster being created from what was once the inner circle members of the Death Eaters. The new sport that was created by the Ravenclaw boy was perhaps one of the only really big wins for me in the ministry, that and the Triwizard tournament that I had managed to get accepted. That said, however, there was now an entirely new headache-inducing situation for me to deal with, thanks to the misguided actions of a Muggle-born girl who somehow knew of Grindelwald's plan and sent a letter with the details on it to her parents. It was easy to understand that what she hoped to accomplish with it, but her parents had tried to warn their friends as well, which resulted in a domino effect that exposed the existence of magic to some government officials in the Muggle government. Thankfully, the damage was easily fixed and even helped to a degree, as it made the Muggle government work more closely with the ministry. Sadly, the statute of secrecy was still in effect, so the girl needed to be punished for breaking it. Which brought me to the most recent headache that I needed to deal with. Dumbledore was coming to plead the girl's case. Despite being Minister of Magic, I know very well that if the old man wished it, nobody could stop him from taking the girl back from the Aurors. Dumbledore and I might not agree on much, but both of us would rather not see him forced to that course of action. I am sure that I can lighten the punishment significantly in exchange for some favors from the old wizard, thanks to our combined political power. At least that was what I thought until I felt it, the suppression that felt oh so similar to Dumbledore's, but not exactly the same, weaker I suppose. The source of this suppression was a very big problem, however, as it clearly came from the Ravenclaw boy that Dumbledore had brought to the ministry with him. What is the meaning of this, Albus? I feigned anger, but internally I was beyond nervous. The boy was an entirely different sort of creature than Dumbledore, more ruthless and unpredictable for a start. There were quite a few known things that pointed to him being much more of a threat to the ministry than Dumbledore ever was. A big red flag was how well the brat knew the laws of the ministry and seemed to skirt around them on technicalities and biases. Now it turns out that a truly nightmarish scenario had come to life, as that same boy was openly showing his status as an archmage, much like Dumbledore, except he just turned 14. The boy was almost guaranteed to surpass Dumbledore and should not be angered if I could help it. A not so small problem, however, was that the Muggle-born girl currently in custody was none other than Hermione Granger, who was a very well-known associate of the boys. We have come to appeal for leniency in the case of Miss Granger on grounds she could not have known her parents would respond in such a way. Dumbledore said seriously, and I could swear I saw a touch of helplessness in his eyes, but I must have been mistaken. While it is a regrettable case, she broke the statute and needs to be punished. I said, acted saddened. What do you want? The boy asked bluntly, with a clear level of irritation visible on his face as his piercing golden eyes stared me down. I beg your pardon? Why, I never. I said, acting offended until a chill went down my spine as the boy frowned. Don't play games with me, fudge. What do you want? The boy enunciated each word, and I realized this wasn't a political negotiation but a forced trade. The boy was making it clear that he was not going to be led around in this matter and won't take no for an answer. I was tempted to outright reject him in spite, but I had a gut feeling that wouldn't end very well and capitulated. I can't just make the charge go away and need to at least appear as though I punished the girl, and that takes resources. Leverage in all the right places, and frankly speaking I don't want to expend them myself. I said bluntly, since the boy wants to do this quickly. To my surprise the boy waved his hand and a small bottle of golden-colored potion appeared in his hand that he set on my desk. Chapter 516, Beginning the Process. Normal POV. Fudge stared at the bottle Nick had placed on the desk in shock. Is that what I think it is? He asked with a greedy expression. Felix Felicis, or liquid luck if you'd prefer. Brewed by Severus Snape and given to me in exchange for a considerable sum of potion recipes that no other than I and now he know. I will give this to you in exchange for Hermione's crime being nullified and all records of it being expunged. Nick said calmly. Salazar Slytherin never did anything by halves and so developed a great many potions with wondrous or even terrible effects. For example, he created a potion that caused fruit trees to produce magical fruit that had random effects based on the tree itself. His proudest accomplishment with this potion was an apple tree that produced apples that had the taste and effects of fine red wine. A tree that he eagerly shared the bounty of to show off whenever he could before a freak bolt of lightning destroyed the tree. Anyways, the point is the man had a lot of potion recipes that Nick could trade to a pody-wondering zealot like Snape. In truth, Nick got the liquid luck for a steal if one considered the difference in value that the 50 potion recipes he gave Snape had compared to it. Then again, he could understand how Snape might consider the value the same after remembering the rarity of the knowledge itself. Fudge seemed hesitant despite the very valuable offer, as waving away a crime like that was something with a bit of risk to his reputation. Nick didn't press the matter however and stood there silently with Dumbledore, who also chose to ignore the fact Nick was openly if a bit aggressively bribing the minister. If it was something politics or money alone could get, the potion wouldn't be so tempting, but the thing about liquid luck was that nearly every part of its creation had luck involved. The ingredients were a matter of luck, the conditions were so strict that one needed luck to fulfill them, and even if they were met, if one was unlucky the potion would fail anyways for seemingly no reason. This meant that not only was it very expensive to even attempt making, but required such a high amount of skill that the pody-wonders who did very rarely sold it afterwards or attempted it a second time after succeeding. I suppose I should be able to pardon Miss Granger due to her clear love of her parents, though the parents in question need to be obliviated of the whole matter, of course. Fudge said with a smile as he slowly pocketed the bottle of golden potion. Then we have no more reason to take up your time, isn't that right, Professor Dumbledore? Nick asked, and Dumbledore smiled and nodded. Indeed, please do have a good afternoon, Cornelius. He said before leading the way out of the minister's office. I must admit that it is at least a small amount refreshing to see Cornelius so compliant for once. Normally it's much more back and forth before we both get something we want. Dumbledore said once they got back to Hogwarts. It's all about presentation. First I acted as though I was threatening him to get him in a fearful state of mind, then hit him with a high-value offer to take advantage of his innate greed to get him to act simply and straightforward. Nick said with a grin. He certainly seemed to dance upon your palm if nothing else. Dumbledore said with a nod. Nick left Hogwarts after reassuring his friends that Hermione will be fine and went to the island, where he set up several protective barriers around himself in a room before entering the realm. It was time. At $% at *, he started to speak, but it was not words that came out of his mouth but strange sounds that defied comprehension. With the sound of his voice, wisps of energy wafted out of his soul and body before dissipating into the atmosphere of the realm. This was the first step of binding a realm, essence dispersal. Binding a realm was a bit like poisoning a body one cell at a time, as you first needed to convert a small area of the realm with your essence before slowly expanding that area like a corrupting influence. Once the entire realm is corrupted with your essence, the next step came, true conversion. The second step was all about turning the corrupted parts of the realm into genuine parts and extensions of one's own being, which was obviously not a fast or easy process. Realms innately resist this process as well, much like how a body will try and fight off a disease or poison. Chapter 517, The Process. One would think that this would be the full total of what one needed to do in order to bind a realm to oneself, but that was incorrect. There was in fact a final step that was both harder and more dangerous than the first two, true emergence. To simplify, this final step was to combine oneself with the realm entirely by devouring the sort of nascent world soul that realms had that they used to fight back against binders like Nick. With it devoured, it needed to be fused into one's own essence and then put back in the realm. A good way to see it would be that you basically removed the soul of the realm and replaced it with your own, which was obviously a very risky thing. For true Daedra this wasn't a huge issue, as even if it killed them they would eventually regenerate from the waters of oblivion. Nick however was not a true Daedra, and thus if this process failed he would die permanently. Of course none of that was something Nick needed to worry about quite yet, as he was still on the first part of the process. Taking a seat, Nick's soul and body continued to release wisps of energy that dispersed into the surroundings like a drop of ink in a cup of water. This wasn't visible with mere eyes, but if it was, that would be sort of what it would look like. This was also not a quick process either, as Nick had to straddle the fine line between putting out too much essence energy and not exceeding how fast he regenerates it. While he did this, Nick also could not do anything productive like study or research, as it required nearly his entire focus to do. An entire month and a half Nick sat still in the realm, with his only movements being to eat to keep himself alive and awake. He was very glad that elves don't really need much sleep and can easily go a week or two without any issue, and with the help of energizing potions he managed to stay awake this entire time. This wasn't to say that he was perfectly fine however, as he did still need sleep. The lack of it was starting to have negative effects on him, but thankfully he could get some rest after corrupting the realm fully with his essence energy. Nick wasted no time at all passing out once he completed this first step, and slept for a total of a day and a half. During this time a little bit of his corruption had been removed by the realm, but Nick easily fixed this in a few hours after he woke up. The whole realm shook violently, and even the very space and air vibrated as Nick started the second step of converting the realm into a true extension of himself. Nick himself developed cracks on his skin as blood dripped out of his body and seemed to evaporate into a red mist that spread out around him. This was also normally, as it was Nick's vital energies leaving his body and fusing with the realm around him and converting it into a part of himself that in turn restored the energy he lost plus some. To one's magical senses it was almost like a heart beating, as the energy left his body got enriched by the realm that got converted before it goes back into his body in a loop of power and weakness. This step took half a month to complete, and Nick rested once again before he paused the process to complete the laws for the realm. The various items he had collected for the purpose were broken down and assimilated into the realm, causing clouds, water, ley lines, magma, and other things found in a true world to start slowly appearing. It was a slow appearance granted, but an appearance nonetheless. Phew! Nick took a deep breath before the entire realm was suddenly covered in a powerful glow as he blasted his spiritual energy throughout the whole thing to find the realm soul. Gotcha, he thought as he found the nearly imperceptible spot in the realm that wasn't under his control and converged his power on it. Hurk! Splat! Nick threw up blood as the realm soul began to fight back as he started trying to devour it with his own being. Nick was taking serious damage from the struggles of the realm soul, but grit his teeth and pressed forward as it was far too late to back out. He coughed up more blood and his body paled while his hair turned white from the damage his soul and essence was taking that was making him appear to age at a rapid pace. Chapter 518, Realm Lord. It was a violent and highly damaging thing, but Nick eventually succeeded in devouring the realm soul and replacing it with his own essence. The change was immediate, as in an instant Nick had his mind filled with an overwhelming amount of information, as every grain of sand was known to him. Fuck! He thought as he struggled to contain the headache pounding against his skull. His brain wasn't designed to handle this amount of information, and Nick instinctually suppressed the input from his realm greatly. So this is why Daedric princes can get things hidden from them in their realms. They have to purposefully limit their perceptions to function properly. He thought seriously. Nick also couldn't help but notice that despite the realm being fully a part of himself, he felt suppressed in it. To be more specific, his body felt wrong and constraining to be in for him. It was an odd sensation to literally be uncomfortable in one's own skin, but that was just the way it was for Nick. It was by no means all downsides though, as Nick noticed a sort of shimmering pool of chaotic water was rapidly forming in the realm that Nick understood the nature of immediately. This was the font of existence for the realm that he and any Daedra that were to come about from his now very Daedric realm would be reconstituted from in the event of losing their bodies. Nick himself felt the qualitative shift from flesh to essence-based existence that all Daedra were a part of as his truest self transitioned away from mortality. It was funny really, as so very many thought that apotheosis was an immediate thing like in the stories, but the truth was that, like most qualitative changes, a lengthy process. There was also a sort of instinctive knowledge that came from being a realm lord that didn't surprise Nick at all. His own power was now tied to his realm intrinsically, so the more powerful he was, the larger his realm, and the reverse was also true, as the larger the realm was, the more power he had. A good example of this was clear immediately as his realm's size was rapidly growing to match his current level of power. Unfortunately, it took energy to accomplish this growth, so Nick felt very weak until it stopped at nearly triple the previous size. If before the realm was roughly the size of a large village, it was now easily town-sized in terms of surface area. This didn't even include the empty space itself that was much wider, and the sun that was thus even further away as a result. Once the realm and Nick's condition stabilized, he finally left the realm for the first time in a little over 3 months' time. Nick noticed immediately that in the real world he was a day late for Hogwarts and quickly made his way there. POV: the real world during the binding. Like Nick had said, Hermione was released from custody shortly and everything went back to normal as everyone went to their summer accommodations as the year ended. Hermione learned her lesson well and waited until she could be present to try and convince her parents to move out of the city. Needless to say, her parents were horrified to find out what had happened again since the Ministry had wiped those memories away. They were also smart enough to know that they shouldn't press their luck and quietly move away from the city without causing a ruckus this time. Thanks to being rather wealthy, it wasn't hard to purchase a small but pleasant house near the borough that, after a bit of renovation thanks to the Weasleys, was perfect for them. Fred and George had also gotten in a whole mess of trouble after Mrs. Weasley found their order lists for the many prank items that they had invented and planned to sell at Hogwarts the next year. The twins were nothing if not tricksters at heart though, and remedied the situation in secret while making their mother look the other way with their better grades thanks to the crafting electives they had taken. The sports tournaments were also coming up quickly and everyone was excited to go to them. Blitzball was a new and very popular sport that the various countries around the world had been training teams for and had its own tournament alongside the Quidditch one. The World Duo Tournament, the event was called, and the international community had gone nuts in excitement. Record ticket pre-orders and amounts had the teams and people funding them over the moon in happiness, as it was slated to be one of the biggest sporting events in centuries for the wizarding community. Chapter 519, Return and Confronted. There were a few other things that had happened during the months that Nick was busy. Among them was the news that he was an archmage like Dumbledore, which many factions with spies in the Ministry learned after his trip to it with Dumbledore. Nick had been expecting this information to get out when he bared his power during that trip. For the foreign wizarding communities, it became a priority to keep a close eye on Nick to make sure there wasn't another Grindelwald or Voldemort in the making. Most of the information gathered said that this wasn't the case, but in all matters like this, caution was always advised. The Order of the Golden Sands was one faction that had been on high alert after getting the news, as Tier 4 wizards were basically walking nukes and they had offended Nick previously and were worried he'd attack them. Yet as time went on, many noticed that there had been no trace of activity from Nick at all. Even the royal vampires had been unable to get any response from Nick, which had caused many to wonder just what was going on. Even as the tournaments came and went, there was no sign of him at all, no letters, no replies, nothing at all. When Nick was absent from the first day of Hogwarts, however, Dumbledore also got concerned. Another piece of news was that Grindelwald had started his sacrifices in North and South America, which was the last places he needed for his ritual preparations to be complete. This made those in the know begin stocking up on whatever they felt they might need in the next coming period. In a more than ironic twist, Fudge used the liquid luck to try and find something that would boost his reputation for the upcoming re-election and found one Barty Crouch Jr. under Imperius by his father. It was a massive scandal and had Crouch Sr. imprisoned while Crouch Jr. was given the Dementor's kiss for escaping, which had his father join him shortly in death as he refused to eat until his body collapsed and ended him. In a way, it was spitting in the Ministry's face as he chose death over his deserved punishment. Regardless of that, however, Fudge got the accolades that he wanted at the small price of a bottle of potion nobody else knew about. When Nick showed up in Hogwarts, it sent a ripple throughout the school as everyone who saw him started gossiping about him. "Where the bloody hell have you been?" Ron asked angrily when he saw Nick. He wasn't alone either, as all of Nick's friends were also very much upset at how Nick seemed to drop off the face of the planet over the summer. "I told you before the year was out that I would be too busy to respond over the summer," Nick pointed out, not happy at being confronted like this. "Yet, and we assumed that meant you'd still be reachable, not whatever in Merlin's name you were doing. Also, what the hell is up with that presence you are giving off? It's like you aren't even here." "Wait, you are actually here, right?" Harry asked while Luna poked Nick with a finger just to make sure he was there. "What I was doing took up my entire attention, so obviously I couldn't respond or even check my mail. Also, my lack of presence is because of what I was doing, though what that was exactly I will be keeping to myself," Nick said in annoyance. "You don't get it, Nick. Everyone was trying to find you, including Dumbledore, and they all failed. There's out of reach and then there's whatever you did," Daphne said seriously. "I don't see why they would after I made it clear to everyone before I left that I'd be out of touch," Nick said with a shrug. "Yeah, you said that, but everyone was expecting you to at least show up at the tournaments or even go to Diagon Alley, but there was nothing, not even your house elf fetching things for you like normal," Tracy said in exasperation. Don't know what you are expecting me to say about it. I said I'd be out of touch, and if everyone failed to consider that, well, that's not on me. Nick said, making it clear he was done talking about it. Why did you miss the first day of school then? Hermione pressed, and Nick had to admit that one was on him a bit since he slightly underestimated how long it would take him to stabilize his condition. It was a slight miscalculation on my part, that's it. He said honestly. Chapter 520, Bird Ladies and Strange Condition. Hermione glared at Nick, but he refused to budge on his unwillingness to explain anything. Well, you missed the tournaments, so I suppose that is punishment enough. Ron said, acting as the mediator oddly enough. It couldn't have been that great, right? Nick asked, more than happy to play along. It was barmy, mate. They even had Vilas as cheerleaders, not that we got to enjoy them all that much with the uppity French broads that made a ruckus about it in the box we were in. Ron said excitedly. Sirius must have gotten you all box seats then, and I have a feeling that those uppity French broads you are talking about are not the sort of people you would like to get on the bad side of if they are who I think they are. Nick said with a chuckle. Blonde and pretty with prideful attitudes and a problem with Vila cheerleaders. Harry asked, and Nick laughed. Oh yeah, that's easily the best description I think you could have given of the Delacour family's women. They are a very powerful pure-blood family in France that says they are descended from Vilas without actually being Vilas themselves, which is totally nonsense, by the way. Nick said with a smirk. Nonsense how? Tracy asked curiously. Vilas are an all-female race of magical beings that breed with wizards or muggles to continue their species, which means that there is no such thing as partially Vila, they either are or are not Vilas. In other words, it's a bunch of malarkey that should be ignored. Nick explained, more than happy to expose the French family's lie. Why hasn't anybody said anything about it then? Harry asked, confused. I can answer that actually. Daphne said seriously. This surprised most of the group, as usually Nick answers questions like that, so it was unusual for Daphne to instead. What? I can know things too. Daphne said, looking offended by the looks everyone had. Nick merely motioned for her to continue since he was interested to see what she was going to say. Anyways, the Delacours have their fingers in basically the entire French wizarding economy, so even if someone were to figure this out, I doubt they would have the courage to blab about it, and if they did, I am pretty sure most people would ignore them. Daphne said seriously. You are mostly correct, yes, however there is one part you left out. Nick said with a smirk. Daphne looked confused. What? She asked curiously. Simply put, everyone who tried to expose them has ended up disappearing mysteriously, or rather were made to disappear. Nick said with a chuckle. Then are we going to be okay? Ron asked worriedly. Nick nodded. Unless you go trying to spread the information, I don't see why not. Besides, if they were to try and get rid of any of you, they would end up making me get involved, which I guarantee they don't want happening. He said honestly. Ah, so the rumors of your return are true. You had us all very concerned, my boy. Dumbledore's voice said from nearby, and Nick looked over at the man. I gave ample warning that I was going to be unavailable over the summer. Not my fault you all chose to ignore it. He said calmly. I do suppose that is true. Still, it is good to see that you are still well, if in an unusual state. The old man said with clear confusion on his face. Can you actually tell what's different, or are you merely pointing out the obvious? Nick asked curiously. He was interested to know if Dumbledore, who can be considered quite knowledgeable in the fourth tier, can see what is going on with him. The later. I simply can't understand how you appear to be here, and yet at the same time my senses say that you are not. Most curious. The old goat said honestly. Nick knew that the reason for this was because his essence was pretty much absent from his body since it was in his realm, thus making him lack any sort of presence while he kept his mana hidden. In a manner of speaking, the body he was currently in was little more than an easily sheddable meat suit that he was piloting remotely. That was all the bodies of Daedra realm lords were most of the time, and this even included the physical forms of the Daedric princes themselves. The reason was simply because it was safer that way, since while the physical body was destroyed, the essence was rarely impacted, making killing them without destroying their realms utterly impossible. Chapter 521, Mission Rewards. That's good to hear. It wouldn't be much of a trump card if it was so easily figured out. Nick said honestly. Dumbledore nodded in understanding. I see. Very well, then I will trust you to know what you are doing. On a different matter entirely, I'd like to discuss an upcoming topic with you. The old goat said, and Nick stood up to follow him since he had an idea what it was about. It was funny how every other participating country's students were long since aware of the event, but the British students attending Hogwarts were nearly entirely in the dark until Dumbledore dropped it on them out of nowhere yesterday. Once they got to Dumbledore's office, the man clarified what he wanted to speak to Nick about in regards to the tournament. After much discussion I managed to secure you the privilege of designing a task of the tournament. You will of course be required to sign a non-disclosure contract that will last until the tournament is over with. I assume that is no problem. Dumbledore revealed with a smile. Nick had to admit that out of everything that he thought the old man might say, that was definitely not something he expected. Not to say he was going to reject the opportunity or anything like that, just that he was caught off guard. That is fine, but I assumed the tasks were already chosen by this point in time. Nick questioned in confusion. The first task is set, yes, but the rest have yet to be and thus subject to change. I take this to mean that you accept the offer to create a task then? The old goat asked, and Nick nodded. Wonderful, I do so look forward to seeing what you come up with. Dumbledore said with a genuinely eager look. Nick left the office after that in deep thought as to what he was going to do for his task. Before that though, I should grab my mission rewards, he thought as he pulled up the system menu and accepted his mission rewards. Immediately he felt a change in his essence within the realm that rippled into his body but didn't seem to do anything else. The first optional task was not completed, so Nick didn't get the book that was the reward for it, but he did complete the final optional task of completing the laws of the realm. The reward had been a bunch of question marks until now, and after accepting the rewards Nick's eyes went wide as a powerful phenomena swept through the realm and a bright burst of light and sound appeared in a single location before vanishing to reveal a large ornate-looking cylindrical object about 3 feet wide and made of gold. It was an Elder Scroll. He stood frozen in shock as his lordly perception stared at the inconspicuous but horrifically powerful and dangerous object that had manifested in his realm. Somehow he knew that this scroll was called Arda and was tied to the complete laws of his realm, making it uniquely suited to his use. It could not be considered anything but a truly divine artifact that Nick knew he would never allow another person to use under any circumstances. There was a bit of debate as to the true nature of Elder Scrolls, but the only thing truly agreed upon was that they were objects to be feared and respected by even gods, as their power was impossible to quantify. Yet at the same time the scrolls were entirely inert until read or used in a special manner, making them little more than indestructible heavy objects. Nick knew of the scrolls but had never thought he would possess one himself, and was thus unsure exactly what to do with his reward. I'll just keep it to the side for now, I guess, he thought as the scroll was placed in a wooden case that formed around it from thin air. This was one of the privileges of being a realm lord, matter manipulation. Any part of the realm that he had his perception on could be manipulated in what can only be described as a divine manner to create from nothing or transform without trading anything. It was a broken ability that allowed Nick to play around in a way that would make transfiguration and alchemy masters want to rip their hair out at how unfair it was. It wasn't all good though, as the realm was now truly himself, so his mood caused it to change as well. Angry? Rampant destructive forces? Happy? Sunshine and rainbows. It made things interesting but dangerous for anyone inside the realm. Chapter 522, Designing a Task. Anyways, Nick returned to his friends and hung out with them while trying to think up a good premise for a task. The problem wasn't that there wasn't that many options, but rather the exact opposite, in that there was far too many to choose from. There was the canon second task and the several dozen variations of it that Nick could think of just off the top of his head. Now that I think about the canon though, most of the tasks were rather focused on combat and environmental adaptation. What if I did something else? Nick thought with a grin. He had an idea that was nearly guaranteed to throw off the participants, but would indeed be an exciting way to show those watching a different sort of competence. The premise was a simple treasure hunt, but with a few twists. For starters, it would take the hostage idea from the canon second task and implement it as a factor. The second was that Nick was going to create a special area for the task that simulates a random environment for each participant. In addition, there was going to be enemies through the task based on the magical creatures that would naturally live in them. Obviously the creatures would be heavily nerfed false replicas, since the task was going to be hard to die in ideally. Nick had plenty of time to create all this as well, since his task was going to be the second that was to be held after Christmas break. It should be understood that the other schools with their potential participants wouldn't even show up until a week before Halloween, and the first task would be held sometime in November. This meant Nick's task only needed to be completed by January at the latest. So Dumbledore wanted to talk to you about the tournament. Did he drop in juicy hints on any of the tasks? Tracy asked greedily after he returned. Not a single detail. He merely wanted my help in setting up the welcome for the other schools while filling me in on the tournament being held. Nick lied calmly. He had no intentions of ruining the surprise for everyone and decided to lead them down a pointless trail instead. Drat. I was hoping he would have told you something, since you are clearly not going to be participating in it. Tracy said with mild disappointment. Oh? And why would I not participate? Nick asked, curious why she would say such a thing. Not that she was wrong, but in any case she shouldn't be aware of the exclusion from it he had. It wouldn't even be a competition at that point, and literally everyone knows it. If there isn't some rule stopping you from joining, I'll eat my wand," she said with a scoff. "Well, you are right in that I have been completely excluded from being a participant, so your wand is safe for now," Nick said with a chuckle. The next day Nick got started on the project for his task in secret by heading to the Chamber of Secrets. Once there, he began to consume the statues that lined the wall before reconstituting their materials into a huge chamber using the realm. He then started to create a highly complex and extensive runic script to enchant the chamber to be not only spatially expanded by a massive amount but to also have realistic environments. There were a total of 10 different environments that each participant could possibly encounter: forest, desert, volcano, cave, arctic, swamp, valley, mountain, lake and urban. Each of which Nick carefully programmed to have their own unique pros and cons that needed to be overcome. The worst one by far was the urban environment, as the magical creatures for that one were dementors, boggarts and wizards, with the last being the biggest obstacles. Creating the nerfed versions of the magical creatures was the hardest part for Nick, as it was a mix of transfiguration, illusion magic, and runes. The result was a bunch of realistic-looking combat dummies with pre-programmed abilities that were weaker than their true counterparts. It took Nick nearly 3 weeks to finish this part and start moving on to the next step of creating the treasures to be found. Enchanted rings, armor, weapons, wands and potions were created en masse with different effects and materials. The reason Nick did this was because he thought the organizers had been far too cheap in the prizes for winning the tournament. The participants were going to be allowed to keep these treasures, so even if they didn't win, each participant still walked away with at least something. Was it necessary? Not really, but Nick felt like doing it, so why not? Chapter 523, Making Preparations. Do not be mistaken to think that these things were very valuable though, as the enchantments were simple things like having a certain spell on them or even one that hummed a tune. They were more gimmick items than real treasures, but if one was creative they still had their uses. The scoring system for this task of his was also very fair, as the more treasures someone got without taking injury, the more points they got, with the only non-optional objective to be the rescue of the hostage that belonged to them. Nick chose to make that particular part the most difficult, as there would be either a very powerful guardian or several weaker ones for the hostage. Programming the chamber to have the hostage treated like a treasure and not a person was a bit of a pain for Nick, but he did it by creating a brooch that identified the person wearing it as the big treasure that had the enchantment automatically set the guardians accordingly. As for the real treasures, there was a short bit of runic code that had the chamber scatter and hide them both in easy to find and hard to obtain locations at the start of the task when a participant entered the chamber. The final touch was a clever use of the protean charm to show what was happening inside the chamber by having what was the equivalent to cameras floating at a certain distance in the air overhead that could be switched between on the screens outside to see the participants' entire challenges. As only one participant could enter at a time, this was actually a small trick on Nick's part to catch them off guard, since they will think that their environment will be the same as the person who went before them. Setting up this task with all its considerable details and facets took Nick most of September and nearly half of October. The rest of that time was spent in the one class he still took, divination, and relaxing. On October 20th, however, he woke up with an entirely different goal in mind, as he knew that Bosbatons and Durmstrang would be arriving on the 30th. Heading into the common room nice and early, Nick waited for 2 people in particular to show up. "Morning, Nick, up bright and early like usual at," Fred said cheerfully as he entered the common with his other half, George. "You know it, but I was actually waiting for you too, in fact," Nick said with a grin. "Oh? And do tell, what can we do for our bestest partner ever?" George asked curiously. Nick had never stopped helping the twins invent new prank items and funding their endeavors since he enjoyed seeing what they came up with. It certainly helped that they were actually pretty skilled at any branch of magic that could be used for pranks. Charms, transfiguration, potions, alchemy. They surpassed most students in Hogwarts in each of the subjects they actually studied. The reason their grades rarely reflected this, however, was because they took an unorthodox path to learning the magic, so they often had little knowledge on the usual topics that they would get tested on. In about 10 days or so I imagine the other schools will be arriving, and since they will no doubt make a great showing of it, I figured it would be a shame if Hogwarts' reception of them was lackluster. "No," Nick said with a mischievous grin. "How can we help?" the twins asked at the same time eagerly. It took some serious ninja-level stealth, but Nick and the twins managed to set up a welcoming spectacle for when the other schools showed up without anyone other than them knowing about it. It also took them about 5 days total to get it done, though obviously not back-to-back, as that would have made people suspicious. It was close, as the last item was set in place on the 29th at 11 at night. The castle had also been given an extra thorough cleaning to make it presentable for the guests, with even the portraits that were a bit grimy getting scrubbed. The whole school was nervous about the school's arrival the next day, and even the classes for that day were more bearable apparently. Nick wouldn't know since he didn't have any that day and had spent most of it double-checking the preparations for the other school's arrival. Soon enough though, the professors gathered up the students of every years and marched them out to the castle grounds in order of the youngest to the oldest to wait for the schools to arrive at about 6ish. Chapter 524, Arrival of the Schools. There was a bit of complaining about having to stand in the cold for about 30 minutes before Dumbledore announced Beauxbaton's arrival. The entire student population minus Nick and the few who genuinely didn't care scrambled to see where the other school was arriving from. Someone eventually pointed out the rapidly approaching large object flying over the Forbidden Forest, which had people guess all manner of insane or stupid things, that it could be like dragons or brooms. Anyone with semi-decent eyesight could tell that it didn't have a single pair of wide wings or gaps that those things would have. When it got much closer, everyone was left silent as it became clear that it was a house-sized carriage being pulled by half a dozen huge golden horses with large avian wings and red eyes. Abraxan horses, which were one of the few species of magical horse that bore the lineage of the extinct Pegasus. They were temperamental and difficult to handle, but easily one of the most beautiful species of magical horse in the world. There was a bit of a panic when it looked like the carriage was going to crash into them, but it didn't happen, so things calmed down after it landed. Soon enough the door to the carriage opened up and a male student jumped out before fiddling with the golden-colored steps before letting them extend. Then from the inside of the carriage Madame Maxime stepped out, eliciting some gasps from the Hogwarts students at her size. Nick took the opportunity while everyone was distracted by her to step out of line and walk over to Dumbledore. The old man gave him a questioning look but chose to roll with it after Nick smirked and gave him a wink. "My dear Madame Maxime, welcome to Hogwarts," Dumbledore said with a warm smile. Madame Maxime turned to look at him and smiled as well. "Dumbledore and Monsieur Ravenclaw as well, I hope I find you both well," she said, eyeing Nick curiously. "In excellent form, as you can see," Dumbledore said brightly. "Ah, my pupils," Madame Maxime said, motioning towards the students from her school that had disembarked from the carriage and were shivering in the cold due to their pretty but impractical school outfits. The outfits were seemingly made of fine blue silk but were horribly thin and did no good against the Scottish temperature. "If you'd like, I will disperse the cold for you all so that we can wait for Durmstrang to arrive. We have a grand spectacle arranged for you both and welcome after all," Nick said warmly, and Dumbledore was clearly caught off guard by this sudden preparation that he wasn't aware of before now. "Oh? Well, if you'd be so kind," Madame Maxime said with a curious look. Nick smiled and nodded, and for the briefest moment his magic was released as he waved his right hand, summoning a wide area warming spell that brought instant relief to everyone there. "So it's true that you've joined Dumbledore's level of power then?" she said with a sigh as she unconsciously slipped back into her native French. Nick smiled and nodded. "I was luckier than most and had the opportunity." "Ah. Before I forget, thank you for the coat you sent me, it is my favorite," he said in French as well. "I am pleased to see that it suits you," she said with a wide smile. "Has Karkaroff arrived yet?" she then asked Dumbledore in her heavily accented English. "Not yet, but I imagine it should not be overly long now," the old goat said honestly. "Very well then, we shall wait, as I am quite curious about this welcome you have planned," she said casually. A few students from her school looked reluctant to just stand around like that, but chose to do so anyways after their peers gave them scolding looks. There were 2 students though that looked very uncomfortable at the moment and had trouble looking away from Nick. These 2 were of course Fleur and Gabriel Delacour, that were being affected by Nick's avian dominion. Luckily for them, there came a few strange sounds that no one could figure out the origin of until someone pointed out the disturbances in the Black Lake's water. Soon a huge whirlpool formed as though a plug had been pulled from a bathtub, and from it rose a skeletal-looking ship with eerie glowing port lights and no sails yet had masts. The water settled and the ship glided over to the shore, where it anchored and dropped a long plank to the dry land. From the ship disembarked a long line of heavily furred people that marched up the grounds to where everyone was waiting. Chapter 525, A Warm Welcome. The front of the group was a man with grey hair wrapped in a similarly colored fur outfit. "Dumbledore," he called heartily as he walked up the slope. "How are you, my dear fellow, how are you?" the man asked, clearly in a good mood. "Blooming, thank you, Professor Karkaroff," Dumbledore answered with a smile. Karkaroff was tall and thin like Dumbledore himself, but had his hair short and neat, while his facial hair was styled in a goatee that curled under his chin slightly. "Ah, and you must be the infamous Nicholas Ravenclaw. It is good to finally put a face to the name I have been hearing so often recently." Karkaroff said with a smile as he held out his hand for a shake. Nick took it. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Karkaroff. I have always been curious about Durmstrang and the different approach to magic that it holds compared to most of the rest of the world. He said honestly, and Karkaroff looked pleased to hear it. Durmstrang has always believed that while there is indeed a chance for wizards to go bad, that fear of such an outcome was no good reason to deny the curious knowledge. Karkaroff said proudly. Within moderation, yes. Nick asked, and the man nodded. Of course, but as much as I'd love nothing more than to chatter away like a squirrel about my school, I really should be getting my student Victor here into the warmth. He has a bit of a head cold, I'm afraid. Karkaroff said with a regretful expression. I happen to know a bit about magic, so I can take a crack at curing him if you'd like. Nick offered, and the man looked surprised. Truly a man of many talents, as promised it seems. By all means, please. Karkaroff said as he stepped aside to reveal Victor Crumb, who indeed looked a bit ill at the moment. Using a diagnostic spell, Nick found that he had a bit of scurvy and a slight bit of inflammation in his sinuses. Waving his hand over Crumb, he cleared up the problems instantly, which showed immediate results as the boy livened up. I thank you, Victor said with a deep but clear voice. A small matter, think nothing of it, Nick said casually. He had a minor case of scurvy beyond the sinus inflammation, so I suggest having your students consume foods with vitamin C over the next couple of days. He said to Karkaroff, who nodded. I will see to it, thank you for the assistance, he said gratefully. Now that both of the schools are here, I believe we should get the welcome presentation started, Professor Dumbledore, Nick said, and Dumbledore looked amused but gave the go-ahead. Raising his wand into the air, a pulse of magic flared out from its tip, and loud booms echoed out from each of the high towers of the castle as colorful sparks shot up into the air high above the school. They then exploded, since they were fireworks, but unlike normal fireworks, these ones looked the shape of the crests of each of the schools in vivid detail, with them seeming almost alive. The three glowing crests then congealed together before shooting towards Nick, who had at some point taken out 3 silver heater shields. With a blinding flash, the congealed crest fireworks split into 3 parts and slammed onto the faces of the shields. When the light vanished, everyone saw that the previously blank shields now had all 3 of the school's crests on them, with a goblet in the middle of all of them. In recognition of this moment in history, I have a single shield for each school to posses that will forever show our school's bond in this moment in time, Nick said dramatically as he levitated the shields in front of each of the headmasters for them to take. There was a loud applause from everyone as they took them and held them up proudly. Magnifique! A wonderful thing, Dumbledore! Truly a grand welcome! Madame Maxime and Karkaroff said, highly pleased with this welcome. Nick couldn't help but snicker when he saw the helpless look on Dumbledore's face as these thanks, when he realized he couldn't admit that he had no clue this was even going to happen. The old goat just smiled and nodded while choosing to remain silent, which was clearly taken as affirmation that he was behind all of this. Nick didn't doubt for a moment that the old goat was cursing him in his head if the look he gave Nick was any indication. Chapter 526, Chat at Dinner. After that, everyone filed into the castle, with the Hogwarts students taking their seats in the Great Hall in their normal house tables. Beauxbatons split their population between the Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff tables, while most of Durmstrang's students sat at the Slytherin table. The reason it was most and not all like in canon was because Crumb had chosen to sit near Nick at the Gryffindor table. Ron was more than happy to see this, as Crumb was a very good seeker who even played for the Bulgarian team professionally. While Ron's fandom for Quidditch had fallen by a good deal after Nick introduced Blitzball, that didn't mean he didn't still enjoy it. Is it true that you are almost as powerful as the Great White Wizard? Crumb asked Nick curiously. If it wasn't absolutely clear at this point, Nick was the reason Crumb had chosen to sit at the Gryffindor table rather than the Slytherin like the rest of his schoolmates. Judging from the approving look Karkaroff had when he entered the Great Hall, it was obvious that he was perfectly content with this arrangement. It is. No need to worry about the tournament, though I will not be participating, Nick said honestly. Crumb nodded in understanding. This is good, would not be a fair competition if you did, he said seriously. My thoughts exactly, not to say you or the other participants aren't skilled, but I am a bit of a freak of nature, Nick said with a shrug, since it didn't bother him at all. Why do you assume that I will be chosen? Crumb asked curiously. Consider it intuition if you'd like. I just have a feeling you'll be the one to represent your school, Nick said with a smirk. I thank you for your confidence in me then, Crumb said with a smile, like it was some sort of achievement. I am aware of your exploits in the Quidditch field, but have you by chance tried Blitzball yet, and if so, what are your thoughts on the matter? Feel free to speak candidly, as I truly want to know how a professional athlete sees my sport, Nick asked while casually changing the subject. Before Crumb could answer, however, Dumbledore made his whole welcoming speech from canon before the food arrived. Nick wasn't shy about trying the various foreign dishes that appeared with gusto. He was a big fan of the borscht beetroot soup that was a fine mix of sweet, sour, and savory flavors. A few other people saw him trying each of the foreign dishes and listening to his commentary on them chose to give them a try as well. It was to be expected, however, as Nick was a pretty well-known gourmet in the castle, so things he recommended were usually quite good. Quite a lot of attention was focused on him because of how much food he was consuming, however, as it seemed to be an incredible amount. The funny parts was that Crumb tried to compete with Nick in his ravenous consumption but fell short ever so slightly. "Are you also an athlete?" the boy asked in amazement during the meal. "In a manner of speaking," Nick said with a shrug as he fed Nazgul a blood sausage. She was of course in her shrunk-down dog-sized state, but her true size was slightly bigger than an adult Hungarian horntail dragon. "What an unusual creature, you're familiar, right?" Crumb asked as he observed Nazgul that was begging like a puppy for scraps. An odd thing considering how insanely dangerous she was, but she was pretty much the most mild-mannered creature he had ever seen. "Don't let the cute face fool you, this one here is more dangerous than any dragon alive and is actually shrunk down from her true size at the moment," Nick warned casually. He meant it too, as Nazgul could more likely than not slaughter even the Tier 5 dragon in the Molten Lake without any issue at all. Crumb's expression was conflicted as he looked to be torn between petting her and avoiding her. "Behind her horns," Nick suggested, and Crumb looked confused. "What?" he asked, not understanding what he meant. "She likes to be scratched behind her horns, give it a go, she won't hurt you," Nick encouraged, and Crumb nervously did so before smiling contentedly as Nazgul eagerly accepted the attention. "I swear that one's got more fans than you at this point," Hermione joked, and Nick shrugged. "She's adorable and I am definitely not the friendliest of people," he said honestly. Chapter 527, Goblet of Fire. No one argued with him on that point either, as they had all seen him interacting with those around him but of no interest to him. It was a fairly apathetic approach he had, as he simply didn't care, and it showed. "How do you think they will choose the champions for the tournament?" Ron asked. "No one in particular, but everyone got involved. Perhaps some sort of test with a dummy," Harry suggested, but Nick shook his head. "They'll use the Goblet of Fire like they always have for the Triwizard Tournament," he said casually. "The Goblet of Fire? What's that?" Ron asked, and more than a few people nearby leaned in to listen. "From what I understand, it is an artifact in the shape of a goblet that appeared to be made of roughly hewn wood that houses a sort of blue flame within it. The goblet was supposedly made by the goblins with an enchantment that allows it to impartially judge the names within it and thus choose the best champion for each school. While I myself will not be participating in the tournament, I am looking forward to seeing if I can crack the goblin's enchantment," Nick explained honestly. "Must be a powerful thing to get you interested," Ron said offhandedly. Nick shook his head. "The goblet isn't really all that powerful and can even be tricked if one is skilled enough. No, the thing I am interested in is how the goblins managed to keep a fire-based enchantment from destroying a wooden cup for so long. It's a pretty well-known thing that wooden items shouldn't be enchanted with flame enchantments due to the enchantment shortening the lifespan of the object drastically, and yet the goblet is hundreds of years old," he explained eagerly. "Of course you would be excited about something like that," Ron said with a roll of his eyes. Unlike in the canon, Fleur didn't approach the table to grab the bouillabaisse, but Nick could easily understand why. She literally couldn't bring herself to do so with him sitting there, as her instincts warred with her personality. Soon after that, however, all the food on the table was swapped for desserts, so she missed her chance anyways. Nick helped himself to a variety of pastries and creamery candies as he waited for Dumbledore to bring out the goblet. Once dessert was over with, Dumbledore began to introduce the tournament in the same as in canon, with the key difference that rather than one of the judges being Barty Crouch, it was now Amelia Bones who was the head of the DMLE, or Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Nick felt she was honestly a far better judge than Crouch anyways, since as the head of the DMLE she was a very well-trained fighter and was also known for being strictly impartial and fair. Basically she was everything you could ask for in a judge of a tournament like this. With her and Bagman having been introduced, Dumbledore finally had the Goblet of Fire brought to the middle of the hall on a pedestal. It was covered in an ornate wooden box that was encrusted with various jewels and had an old feel to it. What Nick sensed, however, was much different, as the box actively drew in the mana around it and funneled it into the inside of itself. When it was removed, however, this function stopped and Nick could finally get a read on the goblet. "Ah, I see, so that's how they did it, how clever," he said with a smile. "What did they do?" Ron asked curiously. "So as I said earlier, fire enchantments damage wood, they are placed on ruining them in short order. The way the goblins got around this issue was that they didn't at all See, the goblet's enchantment is purposefully energy wasteful so that it would be rendered inert in a few short days after it has been activated by removing that box. The trick was that the box not only refuels the enchantment but also fixes the damage the flames did to the wood, so it effectively heals it so that it can last longer. Like I said, clever. Nick explained. That seems like a lot of work for no good reason. Harry said honestly. Oh, it very much is. However, goblins are prideful little fellows, so without someone like me spoiling the trick, the feat could be passed off as a much greater one than it is. Nick said with a chuckle. You think anyone else knows about it? Ron asked, and Nick nodded yes. I imagine this bit of trickery was seen through long ago but kept mostly hidden out of respect for what the goblet represents, a rare time of cooperation between the 3 European wizarding schools. He said honestly. Chapter 528, Discussing Chambers. Dumbledore then went on to explain the rules for who was and was not allowed to place their names in the goblet. Like agreed upon, Dumbledore had lowered the minimum age to 14 so that Harry had a chance to enter. Other than that, it was surprisingly similar to canon in that nearly every other detail was the same. To the point, in fact, that Nick wondered if it was somehow a fixed point in time and thus would always happen like this. That was the tricky part about time as a whole. Without being able to grasp a large amount of it at once, recognizing true fixed points was difficult if not near impossible. Nick was no seer, so he lacked the ability to grasp time in even the most simple manner without stupid amounts of effort. Once the feast was over, the other schools returned to their means of transport that also doubled as their housing while they were here. Nick was planning to leave with his friends to call it a night, but Dumbledore signaled him to stay, so he made an excuse. Soon enough, Nick was alone in the Great Hall with those in charge of the tournament, which was to say Madame Maxime, Karkaroff, Amelia Bones, Ludo Bagman, and of course Dumbledore. I may have said that we had the tasks already planned out, but without your own that is not entirely true, though we do have a backup task ready just in case. The old goat said calmly. Not to worry, I already completed my task and I dare say it will be the best to date. Nick said confidently. Oh? What is so special about this task of yours? Amelia Bones asked curiously. She was a brown-haired witch with decent looks and a tired expression from the work she has at the ministry. Nick grinned and began to give the details for the task that he had designed and relished the looks he got from them all as he spoke. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled in interest and the rest were also eager after hearing the details. I must admit that I was skeptical of allowing a student to create a task, but I see now my concerns were unfounded. Karkaroff said honestly, and everyone seemed to agree with him. Would you be willing to allow the DMLE to purchase this chamber and the constructs within it after the tournament? I feel it would be an excellent way to train new Aurors. Amelia asked seriously. Nick shook his head. I am afraid not, since I was planning to donate it to Hogwarts to enrich our Dada class with a similar type of experience. If any of you would like a similar chamber, I do take commissions. He said with a grin. I think I can speak for all of us besides Dumbledore when I say we would very much like to have such a thing for our own. Karkaroff said, and Amelia and Madame Maxime both nodded in agreement. Fair warning, it's going to be very expensive, as even for me this is no easy thing to craft. In fact, it took me over 2 weeks just to inscribe the enchantments into the chamber due to how complex it was. In addition, I will need to be personally involved since, as you can imagine, it is rather difficult to move these chambers after they have been set in place. Nick said seriously. How expensive exactly? Bagman asked curiously. Tens of thousands of galleons at the least, and that is with the bare minimum amount of work needed to make each chamber. If you want to be able to adjust the difficulty and realism of the chambers as well as any other features, the highest I would price a chamber at would be a flat 100,000 galleons should I pull out all of the stops. Nick explained honestly. There was a loud hiss as all of them minus Dumbledore and Madame Maxime sucked in air in shock. Both of them were also alarmed at the prices listed but had better control over themselves than the others. Why is it so expensive? Amelia asked seriously. Well, first I have to mix several different schools of magic just to create the environments that the chambers can possibly have. Keep in mind the 10 I currently have are vague generalizations of the real thing and as such lack many details the real thing would have. Even still, they are complex and difficult to create with an enchantment, as they are much less if I were to try and create true representations of those environments. Add on to that the difficulty of creating golems that have a certain level of realism based on magical beasts for those environments, and you are already looking at a lot of money to accomplish. Chapter 529, Business. If you wanted me to add an adjustable level of power to these golems as well as realism, that would cost even more money. Then of course there is the other factors you can add on, such as weather, inbuilt scenarios, reactive adaptation from the golems and environment, and a long list of other possible features. And is it any wonder that the price is so high? Nick said without holding back any detail. That all seems rather unnecessary though. Bagman said seriously. It's a matter of perspective actually. As for Miss Bones, the more realistic the better, since the training in the chamber would translate to real-world skill better, while for recreational use like you are thinking it is indeed way over the top. Nick pointed out. Those batons would like Vaughn with no expense spared. Madame Maxime said in her heavily accented English. Nick wasn't surprised, considering she had the Flamels backing her school financially and thus basically had a near-endless budget so long as she could convince them it was worth it. Nick had no doubt at all that convincing Nicholas Flamel of the value of such a chamber would be an easy matter. Due to Beauxbatons lacking defensive and offensive education, the French school students are especially ill-prepared for the world after the Mana recovers. During the few years of chaos after it starts, such a chamber will prove a massive boon in ensuring the safety of the students graduating from the school. The gods that would reappear on Earth were not the sort to bother with those inconsequential to them, and thus shouldn't attack the schools unless there was someone there they were after. It was why Nick was planning on applying for early graduation towards the end of this year. He was a big fish in a small pond, and those around him were starting to suffer because of his insistence on staying there. He used any magic and his mana would briefly suppress those around him, which heavily limited the amount of progress he could make while in the school. Is it possible to upgrade a chamber in increments rather than having to pay so much all at once? Amelia asked seriously. It would cost more over the long run since it would take more work from me, but yes, that is possible. Nick admitted freely. After that, the entire meeting devolved into a back-and-forth session of haggling between Nick, Amelia, and Karkaroff to see how much they could afford at the moment. Madame Maxime stood by her previous words and thus didn't have anything to add, and Dumbledore was perfectly happy with his donated chamber's current model as it sat firmly at the middle price point. Nick had made it specifically for the task after all, so it had additional features that would normally not be there but translated over to Dada teaching perfectly. After about an hour of pure back and forth, the deals were finally struck and Nick walked away quite satisfied with them. Amelia had ordered a highly detailed urban environmental chamber with basic everything but the human golems that were all to be programmed to have adjustable levels of power and difficulty. Karkaroff on the other hand got a multiple environmental chamber with various scenarios and randomized enemies within it. Amelia's was the cheapest while Karkaroff's was the most expensive of the two. Nick made it clear that he could start construction on the chambers but that they shouldn't be expected to be finished before Christmas for those two, while the one for Beauxbatons would take even longer due to the sheer amount of stuff he needed to do to it. The next morning the revolving door of people signing up for the tournament started, which of course included all of Nick's friends minus Luna, who pouted at being left out. Nick didn't really care about it though, and instead was focusing his time on copying every book in the library thanks to a nifty ability that came from being a realm lord, avatar creation. It was basic instinct for Deirdre to know how to create a vessel to house them, but Nick took this one step further to have a body under his control both in the realm and out of it. There was a slight problem however in that the body he made was what his true form would be after shedding his old one. The appearance was mostly human or elvish, however the Daedric nature of it was apparent. The whites of the eyes were instead inky black, while they were also slits like a snake's and still golden in color. The skin of the body was pale white, while the arms, legs, back and shoulders were covered in soft grey, white and golden feathers much like those of his animagus form. Chapter 530, Early Graduation. The chest and neck meanwhile had emerald green scales that Nick recognized as belonging to the basilisk he had killed long ago. In the same vein the head had silken silver hair and basilisk horns curled around its head like a crown, with electricity sparking on the right side and fire flickering on the left. Each finger and toe was tipped with a sharp black claw and many of its teeth were sharp and predatory. Nick was glad that he hadn't shed off his body like the system wanted him to after seeing this form. While that body was humanoid in shape, it had a lot of beastly features that would have caused serious problems for him immediately. Sure, he could transfigure it to look normal, but should anything happen that required him to drop that transfiguration, his appearance alone would cause him to be either arrested or hunted down. All in all, though, it wasn't a terrible appearance for a Daedra to have and was only mildly off-putting to look at. Anyways, by creating this second body in the realm he was able to have it copy whatever his main body was reading. Thanks to his absolute control over the realm, he even had time sped up so that the main body only had to flip through a book with the briefest glances in order to copy all of the page's contents in the realm. He had only started on copying every book in the library after waking up and was already finished with 2 whole bookshelves of it, which was not even a single % of the whole thing, but still good progress. More than a few people had seen him flipping through the books and thought he was trying to show off, but he wasn't even really reading them. Nick ignored them and only left the library at dinner time to see who got chosen from the goblet. "What were you even doing in the library anyways? I heard rumors you were just flipping through books all day," Harry asked curiously. I was copying the books one page at a time since this year will likely be my last one here at Hogwarts. Nick said honestly. What? Ron exclaimed loudly, drawing a lot of attention. It's no secret that I don't belong here anymore, not as a student at least. I figured that I would apply for early graduation this year with that in mind. Nick said without hiding it. Can you even do that? Hermione asked with a frown. Of course, the requirements are really high, but it is entirely possible. Honestly speaking, I am surprised you weren't aware. Though I suppose it is rare enough that it could slip past you without being noticed. Nick said with a shrug. How high are these requirements anyways? I would love to graduate early. Ron asked, interested. First, no, you wouldn't, since it would mean needing to find a way to support yourself, and second, so high that no one has done it in over 60 years. You need nearly perfect scores in all core classes and at least 4 electives just to even request it. Then you need to show that you are able to support yourself after you enter the world, and then you need Dumbledore to sign off agreeing that he believes you worthy of it. So to say it was next to impossible would not be an understatement for anyone other than me. Nick explained seriously. How in Merlin's name do they expect anyone to be able to do all that? Lee Jordan asked from nearby. Simple really, they don't. I am an anomaly, something that breaks all sorts of rules that would normally apply. In other words, I qualify for early graduation due to being the exception rather than the rule. Nick said honestly. Rather unfair to the regular folks like the rest of us, isn't? Seamus asked with a frown. Nick shook his head. Not really, it's to keep things working smoothly outside of this school. If the requirements were low enough that the regular top of the class students could pass it, it would jam up the workings of the world outside. 1 or 2 young people with ambitions but no idea how things actually work outside this school would be fine if it only happened every decade or so, but if it happened nearly every year, it would be nothing short of disastrous. The fact of the matter is that the full 7 years here at Hogwarts do in fact make you all ready for dealing with the real world, so long as you aren't muddle-headed anyways. Nick said honestly. It sounded harsh, but that was simply the way it was, and as he said, for good reason. Chapter 531, Champions. They continued to chat for a bit while eating about what Nick was going to do after graduating early until the meal was over and Dumbledore drew everyone's attention. Well, the goblet is almost ready to make its decision. I estimate it requires 1 more minute. Now when the champions' names are called, I would ask them please to come up to the top of the hall. From there go through the door to the next chamber. He said, pointing out the door in question behind the table. They will receive their first instructions there. He added calmly. He then took out his wand and with a wide sweep of his arm extinguished all sources of light save the goblet itself that cast a beautiful blue light over the hall. Everyone waited nervously for the moment of truth when the champions would be chosen. The moment the goblet's flame experienced a change, everyone knew that the time had come. The fire grew violent and turned red as a tongue of flame shot out to reveal a charred piece of parchment fluttered down to where Dumbledore could grab it. The champion for Durmstrang is Victor Krum. He announced loudly. The students from that school cheered at this and Krum himself looked proud of the achievement. Karkaroff loudly congratulated Krum as the boy walked to the next chamber, and the applause quieted down as the flames turned red again and another piece of charred parchment shot out. The champion for Beaux Batons is Fleur Delacour. Dumbledore announced, and the Great Hall exploded in applause as the students of that school and more than a few of the male students of Hogwarts cheered for the girl. Fleur had turned to look at Nick as she left but grit her teeth angrily after seeing him have a bored look. The tension in the air, however, grew when all of the Hogwarts students waited with bated breath for the final champion, the Hogwarts champion, to be announced. It became eerily silent as the flames of the goblet turned red once more and another piece of parchment was shot out. Dumbledore was just as eager as the rest of the school to find out who had gotten the position. Even Nick waited to see if Harry had managed to take that spot by his own merits, unlike in the canon where Crouch Jr. had cheated him into the tournament. Nick's lips widened in a grin as he saw Dumbledore's expression look conflicted for the briefest moment before he read the name. The Hogwarts champion is Harry Potter. He said, and the whole school went crazy, though for different reasons. While most were happy regardless of Harry's house, there were a considerable few that gave Nick confused looks as they had expected him to be the champion instead. Dumbledore clearly saw these confused looks and chose to explain. Some of you may be wondering as to why our own Mr. Ravenclaw was not chosen. The answer, my dear students, is that he knew that his participation would not be in the spirit of this event and as such chose not to place his name in the Goblet of Fire. He said seriously. Most of the students in the Great Hall looked towards Nick for confirmation and chose to accept that answer after Nick nodded in agreement. The students from the other 2 schools had bitter looks on their faces but didn't openly say anything about the matter. They didn't have to, however, for Nick to understand that in some way they felt slighted or scorned, like they weren't worthy of competing with him. In his mind, they were right too. He truly thought that him joining the competition would be nothing less than bullying the weak on his part, so he wouldn't have tried to join it even if he was allowed to. Well, now we have our 3 champions. I am sure I can count upon all of you to give your champions every ounce of support you can muster. By cheering them on, you will give a very real boost in courage and make them want to give 100% of their effort. Dumbledore said encouragingly before dismissing everyone on grounds of dinner and the choosing being over. This was one change in canon that Nick had long expected after he did away with Voldemort for good, since there was no one plotting in the background to have someone else participate in the tournament for some sort of nefarious plan. There was quite a lot of celebration going on, and while Nick was happy for Harry, he chose not to actively take part in the festivities. He had done his part in allowing this to happen and felt that gloating about an expected outcome was in bad taste. Chapter 532, Normal Hogwarts. The next few days the students of the schools rode the high of the selection, while the champions themselves got lots of attention from the opposite sex that wanted to leech off of their new images. Nick went to divination like normal and focused his time on crafting the chambers that had been pre-ordered, as well as copying the books in the library. The funny part was, despite the spells on the books to keep people from copying them using magic, there wasn't actually any rule against actually copying the books. Madame Pants, however, looked far more pissed than normal after she figured out that he was doing it, though. Not that he could blame her, considering that she was the caretaker of the books and he was basically stealing her library one book at a time. Still, since he was not actually breaking any rules, she could only glare at him as he worked. As Harry had shared, the first task was set for November 24th, which was in roughly 3 weeks, give or take a day or two. The news event and weighing of the wands happened the day after the champions were chosen. It was embarrassing for the champions as they got Rita as the reporter on the matter, so the interviews were closer to a smear piece than the truth. Nick quite enjoyed the event as he got to invite Ollivander to his workshop and even had a nice long conversation on the advances Nick had made in wand crafting. The old man gave his own critics and had plenty of questions about the processes Nick used and thoughts behind them as he sampled some of Nick's works. He was most interested in the failed but functional elemental salt cord wands. Ollivander showed why he was the best wand maker in the world when he easily figured out a solution to the problem of the salts being too powerful for the wood to handle. It was an obvious solution when Nick thought about it, but could understand that that was why he hadn't to begin with. He tended to try and overcomplicate things when sometimes simplicity was key. In the case of the salt wands, the wood used should come from trees that, while normally not used for wands, would be perfect for the salts to be the core of due to the wood growing in the elemental mana-rich area for whatever type of salt he used. For example, mountain ash trees or old firs would be more tolerant of frost salts due to growing in areas constantly covered by snow and frost. There was a species of fern in Hawaii that lived on volcanoes that would be perfect for fire salts, but was almost unheard of for being used in wands due to its stubborn nature that refused to make exceptions for those it chose. As thanks for the help, Nick gave Ollivander some elemental salts to use for his own wand crafting experiments. The old man had tried to get the secret to the superior growth rate and efficiency that Nick's wands had, but failed. Daedric runes were a secret Nick kept close to his chest and shared with almost no one, and thus wasn't going to share it with Ollivander. Speaking of sharing secrets, Lucas had finally managed to memorize the things Nick had him working on, which showed that while he was definitely not that talented, he could still make up for it with effort. As a reward, Nick had started his vampiric assistant on actually making things with his knowledge. He started Lucas out on simple iron and steel work for now, so the man could get comfortable with the rough process that most metal work followed. The vampire was also on a strict magical regiment that was designed by Nick to fully utilize both his vampiric powers and wizarding magic to their fullest. Lucas complained about how overworked he was as a result, but also admitted that he could see the improvement it gave him, so didn't resist too much. A funny thing recently was that Crumb had got to see Nazgul's full size while he was practicing on his broom. She had spotted him in the air on her way back from hunting acromantulas in the forest and forgot to shrink as she eagerly flew over to him. More than a few of the students from Durmstrang and Beauxbatons that were outside at the time thought he was a goner, only to find out the Nazgul was just looking to get some scratches. Crumb had a hilarious face as he sat there on the cold ground with Nazgul's head on his lap as she enjoyed getting scratched. Basically a normal time at Hogwarts all around. Chapter 533, Outburst. It was at the end of this period, however, when a bit of drama chose to make itself known. Fleur had started stalking Nick in a vain attempt to try and acclimate to his presence near her, as far as he could tell. "You know it is hard to focus when someone is glaring at you for hours on end," Nick said from behind her, making the girl jump in surprise. "How did you get here?" she asked, confused. "Illusion magic, a bit of a specialty of mine I have been neglecting as of late," he said calmly. It's not working, she said angrily. What isn't? He asked casually. I heard that being near something that makes you uncomfortable for a long time helps remove that effect on you. It is not working, she said frustrated. Obviously they were speaking in French since both spoke it fluently and Fleur knew it. Nick scoffed. Of course that wouldn't work in this situation. Thing advice only applies to mental things, like if you were afraid of spiders but lived near one for a long time. Obviously you would get used to the spider's presence without it stressing you out. What you are going through has nothing to do with your mind itself but rather the fact you are a Vila. I believe I already explained this, but I exist as the ruler of all avian creatures. That isn't some fancy appointed title that only holds power because others believe it, but a solid fact. It has real power and thus isn't something you can just try and suppress away like a phobia. Fact of the matter is that you and your family just have the misfortune to be avian in nature and thus fall under my lordship's effects. Nick explained bluntly. It's not fair. Why should we be under your thumb just because of how we were born? Fleur said angrily while tearing up. Fun fact chick, the world's not fair, never was. I didn't choose to be born just like you didn't either, so all we can do is play with the cards we are dealt and try to fix anything we don't agree with. You want to get out from under my lordship's effect? Just cast off your race for something that isn't avian in nature and there you go, problem solved. He said harshly. Nick was honestly more irritated than anything about the way Fleur was dealing with this whole thing. If she wanted to stay out from under the effects of his presence on her, she could simply just avoid him easily enough. Instead she is making a nuisance of herself out of something as stupid as pride. She simply rejects that she is meant to fall under his thumb as a natural course and is refusing her very nature to do so. It's frankly stupid in his opinion and he wanted no part of it, but she couldn't care less what he wants so long as she can satisfy her ego. You want me to just change myself so that it doesn't inconvenience you? How can you be so heartless? She exclaimed angrily. Nick stopped caring about playing nice after hearing this as he grew angry at how blind she was to reality. I'm not the one that is making this a problem, you are. He roared while he lashed out with his mana. I am just minding my own damn business, but you are so stuck up your own backside that you keep bothering me rather than just avoiding me, which would solve this whole thing for you. I'm done wasting my time dealing with you, so listen closely. If you or your family so much as look at me wrong and I will rip out your eyes and make you eat them. Nick threatened while the very air quivered under his suppression as he unknowingly used his lord's presence. He wouldn't realize it until later, but becoming Daedric in nature had made him much more innately aggressive, and Fleur was unfortunately the first person to be subjected to it. Daedra were violent beings by nature and Nick was no different now. Storming away, Nick left Fleur a fearful mess in the library as he threw himself into the dull but calming job of creating the chambers. His outburst came back to bite him when Dumbledore called him to his office where Madame Maxime demanded an explanation. Nick bluntly explained the entire situation, and while it was clear that the threat he gave was overboard, he was also not entirely unjustified in it either. While the Beaux Batons headmistress might prefer to take her own students' side of things, she knew that majority of this issue came from Fleur rather than Nick. After getting the explanation, she could even understand why Nick would get mad like he did. Comment. 21 Comment. Vote. Chapter 534, Dragons. I took a few days after that, but things cooled down between Nick and Fleur as she started to actively avoid him, no doubt under Madame Maxime's insistence. There was a slight irritation in the form of love-struck boys leaping to try and confront Nick for his actions even though they had no idea what was going on. After the first 5 found themselves naked on the top of the towers in the cold, however, these wannabe heroes dwindled rapidly. Trying to show off for a girl is all well and good until it means public humiliation and shame that people will remember for years to come. Besides his normal work, Nick had been accidentally leaving information about dragons and how to fight them in places Harry might see them. He wasn't sure that Harry got the hints, but he was at least trying to help his friend prepare for what was going to be an undoubtedly stressful endeavor for him. The fact Harry was seen reading the information at least bid well, since at the very least he would have some idea how to deal with the task. An interesting but unrelated thing happened, however, since Quidditch had been cancelled at Hogwarts. Blitzball took over. Due to the rules that said that matches were agreed on by both teams unless it is a tournament, the sport was entirely unaffected by the cancellation of Quidditch, making it the only sport available this year. This meant that despite the hype of the tournament, everyone in the castle could unwind with a good sports event while they waited. There had even been a multi-school composed team made that had students from all 3 schools. Krum was on it alongside Ron and a few other people Nick couldn't bother to remember the names of. The redhead never seemed to waste the chance to brag about how he was on a team with Krum, much to everyone's annoyance. It got so bad that the twins went out of their way to bully him during a match even though it had them lose it. It didn't bother Nick though, since he was busy working on the chambers or copying the library. That was until about 2 days before the task, when Hagrid snuck Harry into the Forbidden Forest to see the objects of the first task, dragons. Specifically a Chinese fireball, Hungarian horntail, and Swedish short snout were brought in for the task, one for each champion. Did you know what the first task was before now? Harry confronted Nick after that. What would give you that assumption? He asked, feigning ignorance. I've been finding notes, books, and scrolls on dragons and how to fight them for weeks now, and then I find out that that is the first task. Hard to see it as a coincidence. Harry said seriously. I don't know what to tell you, mate. It could have been anyone who left those things around. Nick said, denying all responsibility. Harry rolled his eyes. I can't help but hope that this mysterious person also knows what the next task is as well. He said in an exaggerated way. Nick nodded sagely. Yes, that would be most fortunate for you, assuming they could tell you in some way, of course. He said offhandedly. By the way, who are you taking to the Yule Ball next month? Nick asked curiously. What Yule Ball? Harry asked, confused. The Yule Ball, as in the one the school wanted you to have a ball outfit for in the shopping list. Nick said, and Harry panicked. I thought that was for one of our classes. He said, horrified. Nick shook his head. Nope, there is a ball going to be held at around Christmas, so you needed a suit to wear. I take it then that you haven't asked anyone out to it yet? He asked, and Harry nodded furiously. You might want to get a drop on that immediately after the task then. I'm going to ask Luna myself. Nick said casually. Harry looked surprised at this. You fancy Luna of all people? He asked, incredulous. More than I do anyone else in the school, but as you might imagine, that isn't a very high bar to cross. Honestly, I thought about going stag to the ball, but decided that taking a friend instead would be preferable. Nick explained honestly. So you don't fancy Luna then? Harry asked, confused. Not in the manner you are thinking of, no. I'd say I see her more as a strange little sister than anything else. Besides, I would be the last person anyone would want to end up with at the moment. Nick said honestly. Chapter 535, The First Task. I can't see why not. You are rich, powerful, and the girls in class gossip about your looks all the time. Why wouldn't they be interested? Harry asked, confused. It doesn't matter. You though should really get an early start on asking someone out to the ball. Maybe Ginny? She's had a crush on you for years now after all. Nick said, flipping the topic back to Harry. It was unpleasant, but the truth was that Nick knew that he wouldn't make a good partner. He was too busy all the time, and in Ondadric nature meant that any child conceived would be far from human and may even be a monster. The only real exception to that would be if his partner was also a Daedra, in which case the children would just be normal Daedra with more power than the rest. Nick very much doubted that any girl who he might be interested in would choose him because of his true nature. That was fine by him though, as he knew that if he reached Daedric prince status, then women would practically throw themselves at him despite his nature. It was simply a side effect of being a ruler that came with the territory and was to be expected so long as he wasn't a tyrant. Early on Tuesday, when the first task was set to begin, Nick made his way to the stands to watch the show. The Quidditch pitch had been modified to house the dragons and facilitate the task, but Nick had noticed a surprising lack of protective measures on the stands. Let's hope that someone will stand in if the dragons decide to attack us, or I will, he thought as he took a seat. His friends minus Harry all gathered around him on the stands, curious about what the task was. Nick found it strange that besides confronting Nick on his knowledge of the task, Harry hadn't told them what it was. Judging from the terrain that is being simulated, I think the task might involve fighting a troll or some other mountain-dwelling creature. Hermione said seriously. No point keeping it to myself at this point, but you are thinking too low on the danger scale. It's dragons. To be specific, brooding females that have eggs to protect. Nick said calmly. How do you know? Daphne asked curiously. I have been aware of the nature of the first task since it was announced and have been secretly helping Harry preparing for it. Nick said honestly. Everyone nearby looked dumbfounded. So that was where all that dragon stuff kept coming from. Ron exclaimed in realization, and Nick nodded. But why didn't you just say something then if you knew? Tracy asked, confused. I signed an NDA that meant I couldn't talk about any of the tasks until the day of them, and even then never with the champions themselves. Nick explained with a shrug. Wait, tasks as in plural? Hermione pointed out, and Nick only smiled but didn't say anything more. As the designer of one of the tasks, Nick had been brought in on all of them by Dumbledore and the others in charge of the tournament. So he was of course aware of what all the tasks entail and thus could secretly drop hints for Harry or the other champions, but that was it. Honestly speaking, he knew that he would get some flack for the way he designed his task after it was revealed he was behind it, but that was a problem for the future. They tried to pry out information from him, but all he could say was "NDA sorry" and leave them hanging. Magical NDAs were crazy like that, as it prevented you from even trying to spill the beans in exchange for a lighter punishment if you broke it. It was very different from the secrecy contracts that meant death if you tried to share what you knew at any time. Soon, however, the first dragon and its eggs were brought into the makeshift arena, the Swedish short snout. Once it was in place, Ludo Bagman started to excitedly explain the point of this task. Nick had little doubt that the lyrics and function of the golden eggs had been changed to accommodate his task, but the first task was still to get the golden eggs from the brooding dragons. Unlike in the canon, the first up to face the dragon was Crumb, who looked nervous as he entered the field. Swedish short snouts were fairly mild-mannered dragons even when brooding, so besides growling and puffing out warning breaths of flame at Crumb, it merely hovered over the eggs protectively. Nick couldn't help but frown at what Crumb did to get the egg, as it was foolish against a Swedish short snout. He used the conjunctivitis curse on it.
Thanks for listening.